So let's do some applications of those rational equations that we looked at last time. So the first application we're going to look at is working together. So if you and a friend or coworker or something are doing a job together, you can use this formula to figure out, like, if you know how long it takes you and you know how long it takes them, you can figure out how long it would take if you worked together. So the formula is always 1 divided by how long it took me, 1 divided by how long it took you would equal 1 divided by how long it would take us if we worked together. So sometimes there's not a me or a you, so this is just person 1 and person 2. So the first fraction is person 1 and person 2, and then together in the after the equal sign. So the first one we're going to do is painting. It says I can paint my kitchen in 3 hours, so that's going to be me. Bob can paint my kitchen in 7 hours, so that's going to be you, because that's another person, another single person. Then it wants to know how long would it take us if we worked together. So did it tell us a time limit for how long it would take us to work together? It did not. So since it did not, that's going to be our x. So the x is going to be how long it takes if we work together. Okay, so now we're going to set up these fractions. So all of these fractions have 1 as the numerator, and then so far they don't have a denominator because I haven't decided what we're going to put in there. So 1, the first fraction is 1 divided by me. Well, we said me was me, how long it took me, so 3 hours. So I'm going to put a 3 there. The second fraction's denominator says u. We decided the u was going to be Bob, so it's going to take Bob 7 hours. And then last is how long it would take us if we worked together. So it didn't say that, so we put in a variable to stand for a number that we don't know. So that's going to be x. Now, when we are doing fractions like this, the first thing we look to see is if we can factor the denominator, and we can't. So now we need to find our common denominator. Remember, your common denominator is all the pieces. So the first piece is a 3. The second piece is a 7. 7 is not the same as 3, so we have to put that. And the last piece is an x. X is not the same as 3 or 7, so we have to put that. Remember, you don't put any repeats, so if any of these had repeated, I wouldn't put them there. Okay, then we have to talk about our excluded values. I should have left more space. Our excluded values are where our common denominator equals 0, because remember, you can't divide by 0. So to do that, we take our common denominator and set it not equal to 0, because we know it can't equal 0. Then we multiply those all together. So 21x cannot equal 0. If I divide both sides by 21, I would get x cannot equal 0. So x cannot equal 0, which means it can't take us 0 hours to work together. Well, that makes sense. If we're actually doing something, it's not going to take us 0 hours to do it. So the next thing we're going to do is multiply all 3 of these fractions by our common denominator. So all 3 fractions got multiplied by our common denominator. So they each got the 3 and the 7 and the x. Now this is my favorite part. What can we cancel? So remember, we can cancel anything that is in the denominator and matches exactly in our common denominator. So this one, the 3 is going away. What's getting chopped in this one? The 7. How about this one? The x. So now let's write what we have left. So from this first fraction, I have a 7 and an x and a 1. So that's where that came from. Then I brought down the plus sign. From this fraction, I had a 3 and an x and a 1 because the 7's got canceled. And then I brought down my equal sign. And after the equal sign, I had a 3 and a 7 and a 1. So I brought that down. You don't have to write this step if you don't need it. So now we multiply all of those together. So 7 times x times 1 is 7x. 3 times x times 1 is 3x. And 3 times 7 times 1 is 21. So now we see what we need to do to solve this. So it looks to me like we need to combine like terms. So 7x plus 3x is 10x. 10x equals 21. Now I need to divide by this coefficient. So x equals 2.1. So what does that mean? Well, that means it would take 2.1 hours together. Okay, remember to read that light blue writing in Math Excel to see if it wants it as a decimal, and if it wants it as a decimal or if it wants it as a fraction. Okay, this next one, another puzzle, or sorry, not another puzzle, a puzzle this time, instead of painting. It takes Fred 12 hours to finish a puzzle. So there's a number, 12 hours to finish a puzzle. If Fred and Wilma work on the puzzle together, they can do it in 10 hours. Then it wants to know, how long would it take Wilma by herself? Well, since the question is, how long would it take Wilma by herself? I know that is X. X is how long it takes Wilma just by herself. Okay, so we know this is working together because there's two people doing a project. So let's set up our formula. So 1 divided by me plus 1 divided by you equals 1 divided by us. So let's figure out, since there's not a me, I'm just going to take the first person and make them me. So Fred is going to be me, so it takes Fred 12 hours. Then 1 divided by you. So you is going to be the other person. So this says Fred and Wilma together is 10 hours. So 10 hours isn't you. That is actually over here together. Remember, the answer is how fast they could do it together. So I need to figure out how long it takes Wilma. Well, it doesn't tell me. So when it doesn't tell me, we put an X there. Next, we need to figure out what our common denominator is. So our common denominator is still all the pieces. So 12 from the first denominator, X from the second denominator, and 10 from the third denominator, 12X and 10. And then what are our excluded values? Well, let me just give you a little hint. Anytime your common denominator only has multiplication in it, the only way to multiply things together and get 0 is if the X is 0. So anytime you see that there's no plus or minus, your excluded value is 0. Okay, now let's multiply each fraction by our common denominator. I didn't leave myself very much room there, so some of these are going to get kind of squishy. So our common denominator got multiplied on top for each fraction. Now we need to cancel. So in this fraction, the denominator is 12, so I cancel the 12. Here the denominator is X, so I cancel the X. Here the denominator is 10, so I cancel the 10. Now let's write what's left. So what's left in the first fraction is the X and the 10 and the 1 from the numerator. Then we brought down our plus sign. What's left in this fraction is the 12, the 10, and the 1 from our numerator. And after the equal sign, the 12 and the X and the 1 from our numerator, after we wrote down what all canceled. So now let's multiply this together. So 10 times X times 1 is 10X. 12 times 10 times 1 is 120. 12 times X times 1 is 12X. So now I need to get my like terms on the same side. So since 10X is over here and 12X is over here, let's just move this one to that side since this one has an X and this one has a number. We don't want the X's and the numbers on the same side, so we'll just scooch them. So 120 equals 12X minus 10X is 2X. Then we divide by our coefficient of 2. So 60 equals X, or X equals 60. Oops, that's off the screen. So what does that mean? Well, that means it takes Wilma 60 hours to put that puzzle together by herself. Okay. So for this one, I'll pick up for distance, rate, and time on the next one.